the way. Augusto, I'm delighted to hand over to you and to provide an overview of a second UN Charter, Modernizing the UN for a New Generation. Please take us away.
Thank you very much, James. It's a pleasure to be with you. So, um, it's difficult to come up with a starting point for this very interesting, and what I hope will be a very interesting discussion. But let me try. When President Truman closed the conference in San Francisco on June 26th of 1945, he made a very interesting point. He said, and I quote, that this charter, like our own constitution, will be expanded and improved as time goes on. It has not been poured into any fixed mold. Changing world conditions will require readjustments. I guess he was making what today we would regard as a fairly obvious point, which is that, founding documents, constitutions, charters, treaties, they have to keep up with the time. They have to adjust to changing world conditions. And one of the reasons why I think Truman felt compelled to make this point at the closure of the conference is because, as you know, there was a sense of disquiet among the many of the members of the assembled in San Francisco with the introduction of the veto in the Security Council, which of course was the organ that was going to be very much at the center of the architecture that was established in San Francisco. And so perhaps to placate the concern, not to say outrage, of some of these countries, Truman felt that it was important to make that case of a UN charter that would be a living instrument, and that it would change as the world evolved. Grenville Clark was, at least for me personally, an important source of inspiration for the exercise in which we have been engaged since late 2022, 2023, which is basically, is there a way to rethink the UN Charter in a way that would meet some of the challenges that we face today? Clark and his colleague at Harvard University, Louis Sohn, came up with, in the late 50s, with what they thought would be a way to modernize the charter, to address some of the limitations and some of the flaws which they perceived, and which Clark especially had been very vocal about in the period leading to the San Francisco conference. Unfortunately, by the time the book came out, World Peace Through World Law, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and there was really no interest among the major powers, to revisit the drafting of the charter, and so we enter into a period of the Cold War, a period of arms buildup, and as you know, the conference, which was supposed to take place in 1955 with a view to reconsidering the adequacy of the charter, has never taken place. So in 2023, the Global Governance Forum assembled a group of experts to essentially make the case that in light of world conditions, the time had come for us to reconsider the drafting of the charter and to think about the possibility of bringing that document into the 21st century to enable the UN system, to become an instrument in the search for solutions to many of the most important challenges that we face. I don't want to make a long list here, but we are all familiar with what some of these challenges are. We have the issue of climate change. We have the very strained security situation, the unraveling of our nuclear order. Um, we have vulnerabilities on the global financial system, which, from time to time have manifested themselves in very ugly ways. I can think of 2008 and 2009 as being perhaps the latest example. It is not a foregone conclusion that we are not going to have a financial crisis in coming years as well. And of course, we have a serious problem of poverty, inequality, a whole range of challenges that we confront that basically are creating a very vulnerable world. Having made this case in this 2023 paper, then we took on the challenge of actually coming up with what we thought could be a revision to the UN Charter. And this is the document that was released in September of 2024, just a couple of days ahead of the Summit of the Future. I want to tell you a little bit about the kinds of changes that we introduced in the Charter. The easy part, which already was anticipated the year before, is what we might call legacy updates. Sort of dealing with some of the aspects of the charter that are essentially dead letter. References to enemy states. There are entire chapters of the original 1945 charter which are redundant by now. The decolonization process has come to an end. The trusteeship system hasn't been in operation since 1994, when Palau became the latest territory that became a member of the UN. And so this was the easy part of this exercise. Far more substantive was what we would call normative advances. In other words, are there areas in the Charter where the Charter needs to enter because to address some important flaw in the existing document? And here, perhaps the one that comes closest to being a very good example, although I will perhaps give you a couple, would be the introduction of a new chapter in the Charter on the environment. It's called the Earth System Council. And here the idea was basically to create the capacity within the UN Charter to allow the UN system to coordinate a global environmental policy, to harmonize international environmental law, to oversee the negotiation and the implementation of global environmental treaties. We call for the establishment of a global environmental authority under the direction of the Earth System Council. In other words, the Global Environmental Authority would become like an executive organ of the Earth System Council and assume the functions of today's United Nations Environment Program. In other words, what we were trying to do is to basically consolidate the fragmented global environmental governance architecture which exists today, and which is not working very well, because in fact, as you know, emissions have continued to rise, and we have looming over our horizon a whole range of environmental problems that have to do with the breaching of Earth system limits across a whole range of areas. The scientists have done some very interesting work in this area. And so for us, amending the UN Charter very much needed to incorporate this environmental or Earth system dimension. The other thing that I think was important, and that I'd like just to mention very briefly in terms of normative advances, was to put human rights on a much stronger footing than was done in 1945, and that has in fact happened in practice since the establishment of the Human Rights Council. What we have done, in a way, is try to deal with the Amartya Sen critique of human rights, which essentially says that unless you have a body, an organization, an instrument that can actually turn human rights into a lived reality for people all over the world, then human rights are just heartwarming sentiments, he said. They are nice things that we say to each other. They are principles that we embed in documents like the Universal Declaration, but they don't really have operational meaning for people on the ground. And this, of course, is his way of pointing to massive violations of human rights, in many different parts of the world. Today, we have persecution of religious minorities in countries like Iran. We have discrimination against women in Iran and Afghanistan and many other countries in many other parts of the world, very well documented in databases that exist, for instance, at the World Bank and so on. And so one of the innovations in our new charter is to bring into the second charter the Human Rights Council as a self-standing chapter, and to give the Human Rights Council the kinds of operational heft that is currently lacking with its namesake in Geneva. I won't go into that particular sorry story, but you're very familiar with these limitations. And then there are a whole bunch of structural changes in the second charter that go really to the substance of the 1945 charter limitations. And in fact, this session, what remains of this session and what comes on March 14, will be very much focused on these structural changes. And so what I like to do in the 3 or so minutes that I have left over, just tell you a little bit about the Security Council. This is a subject on which the group of experts, had long discussions. We at the outset were aware that we had two problems. We had the issue of representation. The council has only 15 members, and since 5 of those positions are occupied by 5 permanent members, we have countries like Germany, like India, like Brazil, like Japan, that get to serve on the council very seldom, even though for their own very reasons, they are, themselves, either global economic or political powers or emerging as such. India is the most populous state in the world. It is rapidly emerging as the world's number 3 economy, and yet it's absent from the Security Council deliberations on peace and security issues most of the time. 62 countries, members of the UN, have never served on the Security Council. If you are a citizen of one of these countries, your voice has never been heard on security issues. So this is obviously something that is a flaw in the current system, and it's something that more and more countries are expressing a great deal of frustration against. And then, of course, there is the issue of the veto itself, which I don't think needs to be pointed out in this particular setting. Just to summarize, this is what we are proposing in the second charter. We are proposing to expand the membership from 15 to 25 members. We allow the 5 permanent members to remain as permanent members, although we put a short limitation on the use of the veto, and I will come to that in a minute. And then we create 5 new positions, which are 6-year renewable terms. For each of the 5 regions of the world, the UN divides the world into 5 regions. And so a country like Brazil, for instance, which has long been very uncomfortable with its status in the Security Council, would de facto become a permanent member of the Security Council, because being the largest economy and the largest, having the largest population in Latin America, it would be able to renew its membership every 6 years and therefore, become like a permanent member, although without the veto. And likewise for the other 4 regions of the world. And then we create 15 additional positions and give them 3-year non-renewable terms. These are the equivalent of the 2-year non-renewable 10 positions that we have in today's council. And we distribute these 15 positions in proportion to the number of countries in each region of the world that are in the UN. So Africa gets 5, Asia Pacific gets 4, and so on. And so this is a way in which we make the council more representative. And then on the issue of the veto, we basically say that countries, the 5 permanent members, can continue to exercise the veto, but it is now subject to a veto override. If 2/3 of the General Assembly, or in the future, and Andrew Strauss will say more on this shortly, 2/3 of the Parliamentary Assembly have the capacity to override the veto. So in the case of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, Russia vetoes the resolution put forward before the Council. But then, as you will remember, more than 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly essentially supported a resolution telling the Russians to get out, that they were violating as a very important principle of the Charter. So in that scenario, the resolution condemning Russia would have gone through. So that's the mechanism of the veto override. Okay, there is a great deal of material to cover. I will stop here, and with your permission, James, I think we can pass it on to Andrew.
Thank you, Augusto, and thanks everyone for this event and for the invitation to participate. I've long been a fan of Citizens for Global Solutions. I think it's really a tremendous benefit to the world that there are people continuing to carry this flag, and hopefully we're going to see breakthroughs in the not too distant future. I know it's not easy to year in and year out hold this position when the world has been moving in such a different kind of direction. What I would like to do is I've been asked to talk about Chapter 4, which is the chapter that includes the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly, and also to talk about our reforms to the International Court of Justice. And in doing that, I'd like to kind of ground what I'm saying in sort of a realpolitik analysis. I think that one of the operating principles that we worked under in our drafting efforts for the Global Governance Forum were that we were trying to be at the outer limits of what is politically feasible. We didn't want to just be totally reformist. There were things that we did put in that were not huge leaps. I think Augusto referred to a couple of the types of things to make the Human Rights Council actually charter-based, or to have an Earth System Council, an Environmental Council. Those are things that I think there is a widespread sense that those things should be done, and they're not revolutionary, but they're really important changes to the global system that would make the governance of human rights and environment much more effective. So there's things like that, but then there's other things, and I think you'll see in Chapter 4, that are a little bit more ambitious. And we could have just done some utopian charter, and indeed some people have critiqued it and said that they think that would have been a better project. Why compromise at all? Maybe this isn't going to happen tomorrow, but we should have a far-sighted vision of where the world should be headed over the next 100 years. And perhaps it would make sense for someone to do that project, but that wasn't ours. We were trying to actually ground what we were doing in something that's beyond the tinkering that goes on in normal UN types of conferences in the day to day, but not be so ambitious that there was no way to achieve it. So it'll be for you all to decide how well we accomplish that. But I'd like to kind of ground what I'm saying in that. The first thing I'd like to talk about actually informs chapter 4, but it's not in chapter 4, but it informs every article in chapter 4, and in fact in the entire charter. We changed Article 2.7, and that's of course in the purposes and principles section of the charter. And what 2.7, many of you I'm sure are familiar with 2.7, it's one of the fundamental articles of the current charter. It's the article that says that the UN can't interfere within the domestic jurisdiction of countries. Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the member states. And that is a very vague provision. It was seen at the time in 1945 to reinforce sovereignty, that the UN should stay out of anything that is within the sovereign rights of countries. But it's vague what domestic jurisdiction actually is. So we updated it in a way that it expands the powers of the United Nations, but it could also be seen as being limiting in the powers. We did something similar. Those of you who are familiar with the American Constitution will recognize in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and that is that we actually sort of followed the formulation. The powers not delegated to the United Nations by the Second Charter are reserved to the states respectively. They're representative interstate organizations as the states may freely establish, or to the people. And so we tried to be much more precise. If it's not explicitly granted in this charter, then it's reserved to the states. And then we also set up limiting principles, which I think there's a high degree of consensus that these are good governance principles in the international order. One is subsidiarity, that anything that can be done at the more local level should be done at the more local level. Proportionality, that nothing should be more intrusive than it needs to be to accomplish the ends that you're trying to meet. What we call in the United States, where I'm broadcasting from, equal protection, but we call uniform, equitable, non-discriminatory treatment, more EU kind of language, that everybody should be treated equitably, and that there's respect in everything for international human rights and humanitarian law, that the UN can't violate any of this. And we have provisions, which I'll cover, that make everything the UN does reviewable by the International Court of Justice. And the UN should not be a lawless organization in and of itself. And there's been, in fact, a lot of commentary that's supported the idea that the UN there should be some sort of legal check on what the UN does. So with that, let me move now. And I just say, I think that this is politically not outside the realm of possibility in terms of this political test, that in some ways it actually restrains and grounds the powers of the United Nations rather than just giving it open-ended powers. But it's much more precise than what we have in the 1945 Charter. So now let me talk about the principal innovation in Chapter 4. And Augusto alluded to this just a minute ago, and that's that we add a parliamentary assembly. Now, this is a proposal that some of you that know me, and certainly Joseph Barada is one person that has been fighting this fight together for many years. This is something that I've been very, very interested in, and the Global Governance Forum's Commission decided to include this in what we proposed. And the Parliament, let me just give a little bit of the sort of mechanics of how the Parliament would work. The delegates would be either selected by direct election by the citizens within countries, or it would be chosen by the parliaments of those countries. Now, this is, when we talk about political realism, this is a direct concession to political realities, is that many countries maybe most countries today, would not be ready to allow for direct elections by their citizens in free and fair elections, which of course would have to be a part of the requirement of doing this. And so the European Parliament, that this is broadly modeled after, actually started by the European parliaments selecting delegates. So we provide for that in order that it's not just an echo of the regimes that are in power, particularly authoritarian regimes. We provide that opposition parties should be represented. There should be some representation from oppositionists. Um, and even the more authoritarian countries oftentimes, in fact, usually have some oppositionist in their national parliaments. So that sort of segues into the next issue, which is sort of how the composition of the parliament is created. And here we use, we provide in accordance with the principle of digressive proportionality, which is that it's roughly based on the size of the voting constituency. Under the principle of one person, one vote, the larger the country, the larger the voting groups inside countries, the more delegate representatives they should have. But with a recognition that if we did it strictly based on national size, then China and India together would have over a third of the delegates, and that doesn't seem viable as a way to create an assembly that's truly inclusive. So we use this idea of digressive proportionality, which is, yes, we're the larger the country, the more delegates, but only to a point. No country can have over 10% of the delegates in the assembly, and every country gets at least 2 delegates, which allows for some oppositionists to be selected. Um, the feeling is that that this could be, again, within this political sort of sweet spot of course, this is an ambitious proposal, but it would largely be advisory, as the General Assembly is today. There's areas where they'd be given direct power, which I'll discuss, along with the General Assembly, but it's largely going to be advisory, which makes it more likely that countries could accept it. And again, having the parliaments be able to select representatives gives it more political viability. In fact, it's a way of getting the parliaments inside of countries interested in supporting the second charter as a whole. Part of what we tried to do was to make this package as a whole attractive so that you could get various different kinds of constituents on board. Again, Augusto's reference to the Earth System Council and the Human Rights Council are ways that we can bring the environmental communities and the human rights communities on board on behalf of the entire second charter. And so this is a way of getting parliaments on board as well. So let me just address, before talking a little bit about the parliament as a whole and how it would actually work from a political point of view, let me talk about 2 specific powers that the parliament and the General Assembly would have that they haven't had before. And the first is under Article 15. We actually give the Parliament and the General Assembly sort of incipient legislative powers. As most of you probably know, the General Assembly's powers now are mostly advisory. It has binding powers in internal governance of the United Nations around the budget, and selection in theory plays a role in selection of the Secretary General, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of telling countries what to do, its powers are largely advisory. Well, here, even in the advisory areas, the countries have to do reporting on whether there's a provision in the charter that says that they agree to do their best to adhere to the resolutions of the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly, and then they have to report on how well they're performing, which is something that's taken from human rights treaties and other treaties to try and encourage compliance. But under Article 15 specifically, in the event of an exigent circumstance which threatens human species survival in whole or in part, they actually, the two parliaments, the two assemblies together, by a two-thirds vote, have the ability to create binding legislation which is directly applicable inside of the countries. And again, the idea here, in the spirit of, again, political realism or political possibility, was to create a provision which allows, in extreme circumstances, exigent circumstances which threaten human species survival in whole or in part, to allow them to begin to legislate. Because this principle of having legislation by these assemblies is a huge leap, right? Because this is what scares people. They call it world government, that we're going to have an ability to begin to legislate globally. So it's only in these narrow circumstances. Now, of course, people will argue about what fits within those circumstances. Arguably, climate change threatens human species survival in whole or in part. Nuclear weapons. I think, without getting into too much detail here, the way it would work is right now, any country can basically hold up consensus, especially if they're a large country, on environmental, say, climate treaties. And this is a way, I think, you'd still have these treaty negotiations. You still want to get everyone on board, but it's a way of saying to countries, look, you don't have a veto power over this treaty. Ultimately, we can go the Article 15 route, and it gives the majority that's trying to get a treaty done an additional a card that they can play to say, let's get this done. I think that's the way it would work mostly in the beginning. The
Andrew,
second,
may I ask you to wrap up so that we can get to some questions and then you can provide.
yes, certainly. So let me just say that, the second area where its powers, I think, are expanded is this veto override. But Augusto really already addressed that. So let me just say I'll avoid going into the International Court of Justice now in the interest of time, except to say that we give it compulsory jurisdiction, which is a proposal that right now countries can opt out of the jurisdiction of the court. Everyone who's a member of the United Nations would be subject to compulsory jurisdiction. This has been a provision that has long been on the wish list, going back to the old permanent court. It's nothing new of international justice that came with the League of Nations. And the final thing I guess I would say is that what makes this proposal, I think, politically realistic is that it is mostly advisory. The Parliament and the General Assembly would mostly be advisory. But what you would do is you would set up a structure that would have a high degree of legitimacy, because elections and democratic legitimacy in the world today are really, even with this anti-democratic movement that's taking place temporarily in the world, they are the major litmus test of legitimacy. And once you had an elected body internationally, hopefully more and more countries would move to direct elections. Hopefully the Europeans that are already doing this would start this way. And then you'd have a body that lobbyists from around the world would begin to use to legitimize, even if it wasn't binding, their positions. And over time, the whole ecosystem of organized political interests would begin to use this system that we have internationally. And as they became comfortable doing this, the world could gradually create a kind of legislative system at the global level, as those interests now lobby just at the domestic level and organized domestically, began to see the global level as a place where they could hammer out their differences. It was a forum for making changes. We would begin to have a different type of decision making at the global level, which could hopefully provide a context for a much more peaceful world. We'd have a more legislative type of system rather than one that's backed by armies and nationalism. And again, you'd have the ability for coalitions across national lines. The parliamentarians would be, it's required in the second charter that they not follow the direction of their governments. So it would work more like national, federal systems at the national level. So I'll leave it there.
Wonderful, Andrew. I'm sure everybody will remember last year's session with Andreas Bommel. He talked extensively about this aspect of European parliamentary democracy, which really relies on cross-border political collaboration between parliamentary groups in order to create an effective political democratic environment. I also would be remiss not to highlight that the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ is a topic of a World Federalist movement campaign at the moment, Law Not War. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to John, who's here representing WFM today. So I will now open up for questions. If you have questions about Augusto's introductory remarks or Andrew's commentary on the UNPA, ICJ, or other aspects, please come in now. I will try to keep this to 10 minutes at the absolute most so that we can move on and keep the conversation moving. So hands up in the chat or sorry, hands up digitally or physically, please. Tad, can you start us and then I'll come to Marjorie.
Thanks, James, and hello, my good friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for enlightening us about this incredibly important initiative, the Second United Nations Charter Project. Andy, I think I'm going to direct this at you. First of all, thank you for highlighting that this distinction between what you all have undertaken, which is a charter that could, a hypothetical future revised charter that could really make a difference in the world, but is also plausible that it could come about in some kind of a near term. And as you point out, there is another hypothetical exercise, which is just casting aside political reality altogether and doing something like, what the University of Chicago Committee did in 1947, the committee to frame a world constitution that created a federal republic of the world. That wasn't very politically feasible then or now. That's a different sort of intellectual exercise. And I certainly, and I think you said this too, think both kinds of exercises are very worthwhile in terms of advancing our agendas and expanding our imaginations. With that preamble, Andy, I want to press you on Article 15. I think it's very ingenious, this exigent circumstances that might threaten human survival. And we talked about this a little bit when we were all together in Madrid. I guess I want to know what binding really means. You know, there's already binding international law from the Security Council, part of the UN Charter itself, that is ignored. I'll just give one of 1,001 possible examples, which is the UN Charter clearly prohibits going into Venezuela and kidnapping the head of state and taking him and his wife away. But that binding international law, which is from the UN Charter itself, was ignored. And as much as I admire Article 15 and this ingenious exigent circumstances thing, what if it happens? What if I think it's 80, is it 80%, Andy? 80% of both the GA and the Parliamentary Assembly say this is an exigent circumstance that threatens human survival and passes a resolution. And then relevant actors in the world say, so what? We're ignoring it. We're not following that admonition.
So, yes, thanks for that question, Ted. I think there's several answers to that, but I'll keep it short. First, at the most general level, it's important from a legitimacy point of view to be able to point to it, even if it's ignored, and to be able to point and say, you're violating international law clearly here. So I think that there's a benefit to that. There's also, as I alluded to before, a benefit to being able to get countries over the treaty line. I think it would be stronger to have a treaty rather than to have legislation, but to be able to hold this over holdout countries and say, if you don't go along, we're going to take the Article 15 route is another way of getting them on board. And once they've signed on, they're more likely to comply. But the biggest argument, I think, Tad, is that this provision actually pierces the veil of sovereignty because it's directly applicable. And what that means, what that language direct applicability means is that when countries agree to this charter, they're agreeing that this can be applied directly in their own domestic courts. So you're really doing an in run around, let's say, the executive branches, so to speak, of the different countries that might say, well, we don't want to comply with this. Then they've already agreed when someone sues them and it goes right into their courts, the courts would read it and say, well, they agreed it's directly applicable, so we're going to actually enforce this. Now, of course, politically, they may ignore that language, but it provides another level of applicability, another level of enforcement where their own courts are then charged with enforcing it, and they've agreed to that.
Wonderful, Andrew. Thank you very much. I'll now go to Marjolin, and then I'll come to Jay, and then we'll move on to the next question, next speaker.
Yes, thank you. Well, actually, I have two questions, and in first instance, I thought they were both for Andrew, but I think my second question could also be answered by Augusto. And my question to Andrew is about when he spoke about the non-intervention principle, Article 7.2, paragraph 2 of the present United Nations Charter. I didn't actually catch when it would be narrowed, this principle, because I understood there are limiting principles, but what would be the other side of this? And perhaps you can explain a little bit more about that. And then my second question, that's about, I hear a lot of talking about decision making by 2/3 of the globe, of the majority. But when we look at all the states we have today in the world, then we have the global majority in the South, the BRICS and associated countries. So would that not mean that those countries would have a very strong, decisive voice in this new United Nations Charter? That's maybe for Augusto then, but first I would like to understand better about the non-intervention principle and how it would be limited or extended. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just take that first part, Marjolin. I may not, I don't think I explained that super well. So the limitation is that there's clear, in the 1945 Charter, Article 2.7 says, leaves it, the UN can't interfere with anything which is in the domestic jurisdiction of the member states. And domestic jurisdiction is a rather vague term. We took out that language, and now we have very specific language. And there's two areas of limitation. One is that anything that isn't explicitly given to the UN, they can't do. So yes, they could legislate under the Article 15 provision that we were just talking about, because that's directly delegated to the United Nations General Assembly and Parliamentary Assembly to do. But if they don't have a direct delegation of power, they can't do it. That's one limitation now. The second limitation is all of these basic principles: subsidiarity, proportionality, equal protection, and in consistency with international law. And so if any of those they're exceeding, then they can't do that. So we're being much more precise, really, in what the organization can do. You could say it's more limiting, or you could say it's less limiting in the sense that, things that maybe people did think were within the domestic jurisdiction of the countries, we're giving them the explicit ability to go ahead and do. So does that help answer that question?
No, can you give an example?
So an example would be that the United Nations, let's say, this would be a test. This is a test case of how this would work. The United Nations goes into the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly decide to legislate the health and safety. They decide to create global health and safety regulations dealing with, I'm trying to stay away from what the WHO already has powers to do, health and safety organizations dealing with chemicals in foods, let's say. then that would be challenged. And all of this could go before, everything can go before the International Court of Justice in this charter. So that could be challenged. If that was challenged under the old Article 2.7, they would say the argument would be, well, that's within the domestic jurisdiction of a country, and it would probably not be allowed. Under the new provisions, it would be challenged as not something that they were explicitly given the power to do. Now, they might argue, well, under Article 15, we do have the power to regulate this because it's an exigent circumstance that threatens human species survival in whole or in part. And they might argue, well, some people, the UN might argue, some people are going to die from these carcinogens in the food supply or something. So that would be a different way of arguing it. But probably that would be an overreading of the powers in Article 15, and they would not be allowed. I hope that helps give us a sense of how that would actually work.
Thank
If
you,
not, I
Andrew.
could certainly we could talk afterwards at some point, and I could try and
Thanks a
explain it
lot.
more.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so can we go very briefly to Augusto and then to Jay? Winston, if you have a comeback, to be brief, but I'll come to you afterwards. Augusto.
Very, very briefly, I think Andrew has already alluded to this in some sense. You know, in the second charter, we're moving away from a UN of states into a UN of states and peoples. And as he indicated, whereas the General Assembly continues to operate under the principle of one country, one vote, which makes the system somewhat vulnerable, let's say, to domination by the developing countries. The General Assembly, the Parliamentary Assembly is elected on the principle of digressive proportionality, which basically means that it operates under a different set of operational principles, and in particular, the members of the Parliamentary Assembly are not representing their states, they're representing the people that they represent, which means that they are not always going to be defending the national interest. They may coalesce around issues. They may build coalitions on environmental issues, on human rights, on gender, on inequality. And I think that this will, in some sense, rebalance the distribution of power within the UN system. You know, the one country, one vote system under the current charter has had some very deleterious implications in a number of areas. For instance, on the budget. The UN charter gives the General Assembly the jurisdiction over the budget, but in practice, because of the one country, one principle, and because the large contributors don't want to be overridden by the majority of countries with very tiny contributions, what has happened is that earmark contributions from a handful of large countries have emerged as the most important source of funding in the UN system. So the system has had to adjust to what was at the outset a very flawed distribution of power. I think the Parliamentary Assembly is a way in which we are trying to restore the distribution of power within the system.
Thank you, Augusto. So now, Jay, if you could be so kind as to be brief with your question so that we are able to get through the answers and move on. I'll come to you, Winston, afterwards. Thank you, Jay.
Yes. So concerning this digressive proportionality, I can see why it would be useful as far as getting things established. However, I can also see in the future the fact that people in small countries and island countries seem to have 100 times as much influence as people in China because of the digressive proportionality principle, according to one of your tables. So my question is, can you put in a clause saying that this principle would be reconsidered after, say, 40 years or something like that, to make it not permanent? Because I can see how future generations might find this very unfair.
Yeah, I think, Jay, that's an an excellent point. And what we've done is we have provisions for continual renewal. This goes into Article 109, the renewal provisions for continual conferences every 10 years, I believe it is, in general. And I think the hope would be exactly as you're saying, that over time, there would become gradually a greater and greater global consciousness, and people wouldn't see themselves so much identified with their states as they are now. And so that would allow for something approaching more like one person, one vote. I think it's a fair point. I think it's a good point. I do think that it needs to be counterbalanced with the understanding that these countries, even with this hugely disproportionate representation in the Parliamentary Assembly, they're still at such a huge geopolitical disadvantage in the power dynamics of the world as a whole. And so this one assembly wouldn't redress all of that. The power would still be with, China, the United States, and the other big, great powers.
Thank you, Andrew. Winston, if you'd be so kind to be brief with your question. You're on mute, Winston.
Hearing me?
We do, yes.
Yes. Andrew, I think there's a case decided in 1980 in the United States, Filartiga versus Peña Irela, dealt with torture in Paraguay. And Judge Kaufman, I thought, representing international law, indicates that Article 2, Section 7, it is not for states to determine what is in their domestic jurisdiction. It is for international law to determine what is in their domestic jurisdiction. I hope you will look at that and look through the evolution of that case in your consideration. In Augusto, I am very troubled by the concerns about political voting primarily affecting the global south and seeking to deal with it, and not a corresponding interest in dealing with voting that emanates from economic power. The IMF on the World Bank, for example, where a single country, in this case the US, has a veto. What about a reform there? I also had some trouble with the human rights focus, where the examples you cite were the violations of human rights in the area of politics and religion, etc., and nothing in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights, something in which the IMF, for example, routinely engages. So those are two concerns I had.
Thank you, Winston. Augusto, if you could be brief in responding, and then we'll move on.
Yes. Just on the latter point, Winston, the IMF and the World Bank, they have different governance structures. They are fairly autonomous agencies. It is actually not accurate to say that the United States has a veto in the IMF, for instance. They have a system of weighted voting, and different decisions require different voting allocations, but there is no veto in either organization, and they have worked reasonably well, actually. The weighted voting governance structure has served them well. The UN second UN Charter does not address the issue of reform of the supporting institutions of the UN system. They are in need of reform. The IMF Articles of Agreement has actually been amended more than 20 times in its history. in reflection of the fact that they operate on the basis of broad consensus and there is no veto. If I may suggest, James, maybe we'll move on because I'm looking at the clock and we still have several speakers
Indeed.
coming down the pike.
Yeah. Thank you, Augusto. Thank you, Winston, for your commentary. So next we come to Dan Perel, who is joining us from his car, which is exciting. Dan, take it away, please.
Yeah, it's not so exciting. It's a matter of circumstances that require various yeah. There's a couple of family issues, so I will actually have to exit shortly after my intervention, and for this I apologize. I also wanted to thank you for calling me out in the introduction as someone to whom many here are familiar. It's lovely to be back with you all. So I'll try to, I will actually be quite brief because I think the legal chops you have already heard and the intellectual chops you have already heard, and I cannot compare to either of those, but maybe I'll offer like a bit of a different sort of framing, which is about my understanding of the project, and then I'll share how these two particular dimensions, chapter 9, and then the civil society provisions, reflect some of those elements, a couple of those elements of what the project is. I think as Augusto laid out quite clearly, the vision, the understanding of the 1940s is very different from where we are now. And a lot of this actually, to me, is a reflection of progress in our understanding of the assumptions that need to underlie the world's order. At the time, the assumptions were largely based on peace and security, sovereignty, even like ending the colonial era. There are all of these pressing concerns if we were to rewind to the 1940s. And I suspect that this same group, if it were 80 years ago, might be having a conversation about those issues and not the ones that we are trying to address now. And so the question really is, how do we determine what the assumptions are now that we need to build our future on, and B, then how do we help an outdated institution evolve its own thinking, both legally and conceptually, to reflect the concerns today. So what are a couple of these assumptions? And in chapters 9 and the civil society portion, I'll articulate a couple of them, and this is certainly not limited to those two chapters. It's just what I was asked to focus on. So on the former, I think that there has always been, or at least in the modern era, it has been an equating of progress with economic growth. And that's totally understandable when need was sort of the driving factor of countries, famine and these sorts of issues. So economic growth is totally understanding. And to me, there's an analogy to and forgive me, I am a representative of the Baha'i community, but there is an analogy to the role of clergy. There was a need for a long time for a clerical group segment of society to say what reality was, because not everybody was literate. Well, then when everybody became literate, the role of clergy has changed. We'll just leave it at that. And I think similarly, now if there is enough stuff for everyone, which there is, then the question is not about growth, it's about distribution. So now how do we shift our economic models to those that are more related to distribution and equitability rather than growth and accumulation? And so you see in the second UN Charter that we've actually expanded a couple of notions in there. Things like cooperation. It's not just development, it's sustainable development. It's about leaving no one behind so you don't have certain segments growing too quickly. Of course, gender equality is more directly woven throughout. And there are just there's a lot more related to these sort of social pressing concerns that are beyond just the economic scope. And then you'll see this new to protect, manage, and ensure the sustainable use of planetary environment and Earth system in harmony with nature. That was not even a consideration at the time at the international level. Of course, many were already thinking that perhaps there was a lot of damage being done. So if you read this chapter through the lens of a realignment of assumptions, then you can see that we haven't gone full bore and sort of said like countries have a responsibility to grow in a certain way and not in another way. Like you can't go too far. but it does expand sort of the notions of economic development. And then a similar one that I'll talk about with civil society contributions is that this relationship between the community, the individual, and the institution has really evolved quite a bit over the past 80 years. It used to be that the institutions of society, government, and what have you, were sort of in charge of making all the rules. They were the ones who were responsible for having the knowledge, and then it was a top-down kind of approach. Over the course of time, we've seen the role of civil society expand, usually for the good, but we have to also acknowledge that there are some ways in which this has not been to the betterment of humanity. And the private sector is a very clear one. Not that private sector is always nefarious, but it is not super accountable, that's for sure. And it has a different role in society from the role of the public sphere. So what we have done is tried to expand the role of, I would say, the community. I would say that civil society engagement is an expression of community contribution to the international order. So it could be a community of indigenous peoples or certain faith-based organizations, interest groups focusing on hunger, what have you. And then the individual is actually through the UNPA, the Parliamentary Assembly, sort of where the individual expression can find some coherence. And then what you have is an international order that has allowed for a new set of assumptions in decision making. Of course, institutions are the ultimate arbiter. We don't undercut their role, but we sort of augment it by introducing some elements of civil society participation throughout the UN, not just in the Economic and Social Council. And we acknowledge the diversity of the different institutions, the different arms of the United Nations that will naturally have different engagement mechanisms for various reasons, security being one, justice being another, the ICJ, and then Economic and Social Council being a third. So like there are different access points, but every one of these dimensions of the UN is responsible to create some form of civil society engagement, an overarching body to look at it that has a presumption of innocence rather than guilt, a presumption of inclusion rather than exclusion. And then very importantly, because this is really a burgeoning area of understanding, and there are really diverse views on it, there is a provision in there for looking periodically at how this is working and really thinking through ways that it can be constructive rather than oppositional. If it's oppositional, how can we correct it? All of those things. So again, just to maybe summarize, the question to me is, we have a new set of assumptions today. How can those find expression at the level of the international institutions? Chapters 9 and civil society are two such expressions, and Andrew and Augusto, and then forthcoming Veselin and others will speak to their own areas of expertise. So I'll stop there, and thanks so much. And I'm sorry that I do have to go because I have to register my mom for an assisted living place.
Well, Dan, then I will just say thank you very much for joining us, as ever. Incredibly insightful of you. All the best with your mum. We'll see you later. So in that case, what we'll do is we'll make good time and we will move on to Guy. Guy, I hope you can hear me. Guy Sinclair has joined us. Guy is an associate professor at the University of Auckland, Faculty of Law. And it is very early in the morning there. Oh, has he just disappeared? He was on screen and now he's gone. Oh, you're in front of me. Apologies, Guy. Moved. Wonderful. In that case, let me just screen through. So Guy will be giving us the highlights from chapter 6 and 7. Guy, with that introduction, and sorry for dropping you in hot, but take it away, please.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me well enough?
We do, yes.
All right. So I apologize for joining late in the session. It is just gone 7 a.m. on a Sunday here in Auckland, New Zealand. So it's a little bit early for me, and I wasn't able to get up any earlier than this. So I also apologize if I've missed some important points that others have made, or I end up repeating maybe some points that others have made. I'm going to focus, if I can. I see we're running a little late, so I'll focus my comments on Chapter 7 of the second UN Charter, because I think this is the most challenging. It's always been the most challenging chapter in the Charter in many ways. and certainly is no less challenging to try to revise or think about revising today than it has been to try to implement over the past 70 years. So maybe let me start by giving you 3 reasons. You probably all know this all very, very well, but remind us of 3 reasons perhaps why Chapter 7 in the original charter was so problematic and why it remains so today. So first, of course, this is the chapter that gives the Security Council powers to take coercive action, including the use of military force against states in cases of a threat to the peace or a breach of the peace or an act of aggression in order to restore international peace and security. And so it touches on the most sensitive issues of state sovereignty, jealously guarded, of course, by all states, not just the great powers. And you'll recall that under the Charter, the non-consensual use of force is only permitted in 2 circumstances. Firstly, in self-defense, including collective self-defense, and secondly, if authorized by the Security Council under this chapter, under Chapter 7. The second reason why the chapter is so challenging as originally drafted is, or has been, or was so challenging in over the past 70 years, is that it sets up a whole apparatus for collective security to deal with those situations that I've just mentioned, threat to the peace, breach of the peace, aggression, and so on. And that apparatus included special agreements under which member states would make armed forces and assistance and facilities available to the Security Council on its call, and the Military Staff Committee to direct those forces, and so on. And it turned out that even setting up such an apparatus was too much of a challenge to state sovereignty, and certainly too difficult in the context of a nascent Cold War in the 1940s and 1950s, so it was never put into effect. And third, as you all know, all decisions under Chapter 7 are subject to the veto of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So obviously, where it's one of the permanent 5 members that is threatening the peace or breaching the peace or committing an act of aggression, no authorization of coercive action will be taken under Chapter 7. I mean, there was not quite the same situation, but there was one exception, as you are, I'm sure, all aware, in 1950, when the Soviet Union vacated its seat at the Security Council, and a decision was able to be made. But I'm sure we can all think of more recent examples where a permanent 5 member has threatened the peace or breached the peace or committed an act of aggression. And it's certainly also the case where one of the permanent 5 considers that one of their essential interests are at stake. So it's not only when a permanent 5 member itself is doing one of those things, but where they just think one of their interests is at stake, and they'll intervene and exercise the veto. So despite all those challenges, the Security Council actually has often invoked its powers to take action under Chapter 7, either explicitly or implicitly. Very occasionally it's explicit, such as in authorizing member states or coalitions of states to take action, like in Korea or in Iraq in 1990-91. Although that was all done without the apparatus of the Military Staff Committee and so on. But more often, the Security Council has invoked Chapter 7, and again, often implicitly rather than explicitly, in authorizing peacekeeping missions. So we need to distinguish peacekeeping from the kinds of actions envisaged in Chapter 7. Of course, peacekeeping rests essentially on the principles of the consent of the parties, impartiality, non-use of force except in self-defense, and those are not principles anticipated in Chapter 7, which is non-consensual use of force. I'll just note here in passing, because I'm not focusing on it, that Chapter 6 in the Second UN Charter incorporates provisions dealing with peacekeeping. In other words, sort of codifying, in some ways, the practice of peacekeeping as it has developed. But this really is a key point, that over the last 70 years, the UN's practices of dealing with questions of international peace and security have evolved significantly, going beyond the 4 corners of the Charter, and that's why peacekeeping is sometimes said to fall under Chapter 6.5, something in between Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. And peace operations today are very varied and complex. So they more often deal with internal conflicts rather than interstate conflicts. They deal with the kinds of conflicts that the Charter doesn't really concern itself with, inter-ethnic conflicts, things of that kind that are occurring within states rather than between states. And peacekeeping over recent years has blended sort of what we might think of as traditional peacekeeping of the sort of the UN emergency force 1956 type with peace enforcement, policing, and all sorts of governance functions. And peace operations often combine efforts from a variety of different international organizations, not just the United Nations. So any given peace operation may be a sort of a joint operation of the United Nations and the African Union, for example, or the United Nations and the African Union and the European Union and ECOWAS, or other regional and sub-regional organizations, in order to leverage their relative comparative advantages. So I think that's an important element is to understand that we have accumulated this vast body of practice, which should not be, I think, easily discarded in an attempt sort of just to revert back to the notions of 1945. But there are also many circumstances where we might wish the Security Council might authorize military action, also where the 1945 Charter didn't anticipate that it would. So especially to prevent or to stop mass atrocities, ethnic cleansing, even genocide, and we all think most famously, of course, of Rwanda in 1994, Srebrenica in 1995, but we can probably all think of other examples as well. So then, how to think about revising these chapters, especially chapter 7, when we're actually seeing now more, I think, not fewer assertions of state sovereignty than we might have 20, 30 years ago, when permanent members of the Security Council seem more intent than ever in asserting their prerogatives, in flexing their muscles, to the extent of flagrantly breaching the most fundamental norms of international law. And when we're living in a time when, as Mark Carney put it, the post-Cold War rules-based world order has undergone a fundamental rupture. So we weren't quite at that point 2 years ago when drafting a second United Nations Charter, but we were pretty close to it. And even then, we could see that living at this moment, it's very difficult to look ahead, 5 years, let alone 10, 20, 50, however long we might want this second UN Charter to be put into operation. And at the same time, the idea of rupture, also implies that things can change very quickly, that circumstances might suddenly allow new possibilities. So the proposed revisions to Chapter 6 and 7 in the Second United Nations Charter try to take account of a variety of possibilities. And they build on the existing UN structures, but also try to push it forward and to incorporate, as I've mentioned, the accumulated practice, the acquis, as it were, of the United Nations over the past 70 years, while also recognizing that reforms in one part of the United Nations system would require and maybe also precipitate reforms or changes in other parts. So if I just focus on Chapter 7, the second United Nations Charter proposes, I would say, three main changes. First, it proposes to widen the scope of circumstances in which the Security Council would be empowered to take coercive actions. And that would indeed be to include these new sorts of threats, the ones, well, not exactly new, but newly recognized as important, such as imminent threats or acts of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In other words, the crimes recognized under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The second main change is that this second United Nations Charter proposes that a UN peace force be established on a standing basis, and this would comprise full-time personnel as well as a reserve force, both on a volunteer basis, both under the direction of the reformed Security Council with the advice and assistance of the Secretariat. And then third, the second UN Charter proposes that the General Assembly and the new Parliamentary Assembly together would have a kind of oversight of the peace force, not on a day-to-day, not on an operational basis, that would remain under the Security Council. And here you can see we're sort of trying to split the baby a little bit. We're trying to have a sort of intermediate kind of solution. But in the sense that these two more representative organs, the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly, would together enact laws and regulations that govern the peace force and would ensure that actions taken under Chapter 7 comply with international law, including international human rights law, international refugee law, international humanitarian law. So let me just wrap up by saying, or noting rather, that this second United Nations Charter anticipates the elaboration of a more detailed protocol on the UN Peace Force, and indeed it includes a bit of an outline of one, covering methods of recruitment and staffing for the Peace Force, modalities of administration, logistics, weaponry, an action protocol, member obligations, and so on. I think this is still a work in progress, but the idea is to sketch out some of the more practical aspects of what would need to be done in order to establish a peace force on this kind of a basis, this kind of a standing basis. And the more one gets into these kind of details, the more one appreciates the magnitude of the challenges of making the kinds of shifts necessary to construct a system of collective security that is more just and rule-bound, especially at the present moment. So you get into thinking about weaponry and the need for interoperability, and then you realize, well, maybe we need to set up a separate weapons manufacturer that's under UN control, and it all starts to sound rather far-fetched, frankly, at this particular moment in time. Nevertheless, it's important work for anybody to start thinking about what are the practical realities of this, if we're going to go in this direction. And I can say that the work on this protocol on the Peace Force, really tries to take seriously many of qualms would be a gentle way of putting it, fears that states and peoples would have in handing over monopoly of force in the international realm to an international body. And so it tries to, and the chapters in the second UN Charter try to include a number of provisions that are designed to ensure oversight, accountability, and restraint in accordance with the rule of law in a way that would sort of counterbalance or at least maybe allay some of those fears if it's all put into effect. So, for example, the Peace Force is required to act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the Charter, to comply with the rules of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and so on. And these will then shape the Peace Force's rules of engagement. And there's a sort of move towards envisaging that the Peace Force would have a proper system of criminal and disciplinary jurisdiction over its personnel, and there'll be provisions on monitoring and evaluation and auditing and reporting and all those sorts of things. In this sense, as I think you might be gathering, the protocol and the revisions proposed in at least these chapters of the Second United Nations Charter really is an effort of imagination, right, from a very difficult moment in the UN's history. So how can we realistically, or approaching realistically, imagine and then maybe try to enact a new kind of international system, a world where states might be even plausibly ready and willing to hand over some of their powers to resolve their disputes to a truly international body that's backed by force. Hopefully that's given enough of an overview of those chapters, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Guy, wonderful. Thank you. I think really bringing home how our imagination and how we imagine the future is going to dictate what we do about it. I'm reminded the first time I met John Vlasto in Vienna when he, and I will paraphrase, said, in crises, we have a tendency to cast around for a plan lying around somewhere. And we have to hope that we have one. I think in both the considerations that you've just mentioned, but in general, the second UN Charter is an indication that we have a plan lying around and we definitely have a crisis precipitating around us. So my suggestion is that we make a brief break for questions if we have them. Dan isn't with us, but perhaps we can come to others. And for Guy. So I see Evan has his hand up. I will again ask everyone to be brief. We are already at time and we still have
Yes.
wrestling to come. Evan, please.
Well, I have a very brief question. Is there any recognition of the doctrine of responsibility to protect in the new second charter? And especially from the standpoint of codifying national government responsibilities to people, it would seem to me useful.
Guy.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't think we use the language of responsibility to protect. Somebody might correct me if I'm wrong, just from memory. But of course, the changes that we've proposed to the Chapter 7 cover many of the concerns, or some the core concerns, let's say, of that doctrine, of the idea of responsibility to protect. So the idea that the Security Council, the peace force, the Security Council can authorize action where there's a threat of genocide or actual genocide ongoing, or war crimes, or crimes against humanity. That was our. Of course, the responsibility to protect remains quite controversial. That whole idea of sort of something leaning towards a humanitarian intervention justification for force remains quite controversial. It's a big departure from the the charter scheme, as the 1945 charter scheme, of course. So again, this was one of those areas, I would say, where we were trying to balance a number of considerations, allowing states individually to take action on the basis of a doctrine of responsibility to protect, I think seemed to us to be going too far, but putting that firmly under the aegis of an institutional framework, an institutionalized response through Security Council seemed to be the right sort of response. Opinions may differ, right? And these are all difficult questions, I think. But that's where I think we incorporated it. I don't know if August or others want to add to that or have a different view.
We also added to the preamble and Article 1 language, which is very similar to responsibility to protect. We, in fact, enlarged the number of principles of the organization, Article 1, Paragraph 2, with recognition that the international community must protect in situations of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So in addition to Chapter 7, we also have language in the preamble and in Article 1.
I might add that, of course, the body of treaty, not legislation, but international treaties remains alive, and an initiative that CGS is supporting and is led by a member of our advisory board, Leila Sadat, to introduce a UN Crimes Against Humanity treaty will also create a new legislation that will, or new treaty that will perhaps also influence where we see the need to intervene. So if there are no more questions, I will thank Guy for, oh no, we have Tad.
If I may, James, and thank you. This is a comment of admiration for you, Guy, and for you, Augusto. You mentioned, Guy, you just kind of almost in passing, that this is a volunteer force, that people can volunteer directly to serve the United Nations. And I really want us to emphasize that, and I want us to appreciate how important that is, because no such military force exists in the world today. If I, for example, imagine me a little bit younger, if I said, I want to go into Sudan, Sudan has these horrible atrocities taking place and horrible suffering, but it's not even a matter of debate in this country, in the United States. I happen to be an American, that we should send the United States military into Sudan to try to make a difference there because it's so remote from American national interests. The only place that individuals in America, in the United States of America, or anywhere else in the world today, can volunteer to serve in a military force is a national military force that only acts when national interests are engaged. And this would be a military force, A, that individuals could volunteer to directly, and B, the way that I, as you know, Augusto, that I've put it several times in our deliberations, it would create the possibility for people, for individual citizens all around the world to volunteer not just to serve their countries, but to serve humanity, to serve not just their national interests, but common human interests. And I think that's a great conceptual element of the Second United Nations Charter that we all ought to appreciate and emphasize.
Thank you, Tad. So, with that said, I will thank Guy for having made a Herculean effort to get up so early, and I will move on to Veselin, who's making a similarly Herculean effort to stay up late, where it's just past midnight in Calcutta. So I will ask Veselin to give us a preview of Chapter 14 and take us through the UNSG process.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody, for staying long with us. Let me touch on the Secretary General Office. And as with other chapters, we look at what has changed over those 8 years since 1945 and what needs to be done as to improve the efficiency of this office. And obviously, one issue that we all know is in the past, the selection of Secretary General has always been kind of a issue of the Security Council making that choice. The permanent five effectively had to agree or disagree. Often they did disagree, and there were a lot of anecdotes and paradoxes. How many times at the time Soviet Union and the Western power took so long to find a suitable candidate, and that single candidate to go to the General Assembly for somehow rubber stamping. Obviously, that's not the way to select the Secretary General. That has been recognized in the past. We are not the first to say that. Even back 10 years ago, there was a campaign, One for 7 billion, and at that campaign, there was suggestion by the elders, for example, to have a longer single term of the Secretary General, 7 years or 8 years, and that will allow the office to be very independent. In other words, the Secretary General will not need to be re-elected after 5 years. It doesn't need to be he or she dependent or obedient to the permanent five. A longer single term will ensure that independence of the office, and also it will reduce the bargaining power of the Secretary General and the Security Council. Obviously, what we have seen, for example, with the selections in the past, specifically Ban Ki-moon, it was bribing the members of the Security Council to vote in exchange for offering some high-level posts to those members. All of this will go if there are two major changes. One, single longer term, and second, to have more than one candidate proposed by the Security Council to the General Assembly, so that the final vote goes into the hands of the 193 members of the General Assembly. Unless those two changes happen, all future Secretary General will remain obedient to the Security Council and especially to the permanent five. And there is no other way out apart from introducing those changes. Let me say, now we are in the campaign. We are 2026. We have already candidates that announced themselves to run. But I'm disappointed not to hear the same strong voices like 10 years ago with the campaign One for 7 billion at the time, to have those two changes implemented. And by the way, for that, we don't need really to amend the UN Charter. Those can be done by the General Assembly alone. The General Assembly alone tomorrow can introduce those changes without asking any advice and any permission from the permanent five. And that is really something very urgent. So I ask all of you to consider through your networks, through your advocacy to support the coalition. Now is called One for 8 billion. And it is also campaigning for other improvements in the process, such as more women candidates. We already seen that last time. There were many female candidates already back in 2016. We see a lot of excellent female candidates this time. So I hope that will be finally resolved. So we will have a female Secretary General in the end of this year. But the other two changes remain to be made. And as I mentioned, one is to have a longer term, something not new. There was already a General Assembly resolution back in 1996. 30 years ago, that idea already has been circulated and has been adopted in a General Assembly resolution. Unfortunately, the member states didn't follow up after that. And the second is the President of the General Assembly simply to say to the President of the Security Council, give us more than one candidate, otherwise we will not approve anybody. So simple. Without any changes in the charter, that can be done within the next month. Unfortunately, as I said, disappointingly, I don't see much support for those two changes to be made this time. Again, my explanation of that somehow member states are in the mood of crisis, as we just mentioned, and they think that this is not the right time to introduce changes. We argue exactly the opposite. Our team behind the second charter argues exactly the opposite. Crisis is the best time to do changes. If everything is beautiful, everybody will say, why change? Changes must come when everything is not beautiful, when everything is tragic as it is at the moment. And that also connects something my colleagues earlier discussed. The relationship between General Assembly and the Security Council should change. Currently, again, it is very much obedience to the Security Council. Everybody tries first and foremost to ask the question, what will the P5 say? This is not the beginning of any conversation. We should not ask, what will the P5 say? Unitingly, all the 129 members can introduce changes. This is the two-thirds majority of the General Assembly. They can easily make changes like those that we suggest, and they should just go ahead and do those, including Article 109. That's my last point. Article 109 was put into the UN Charter exactly by the rebels in San Francisco who are not happy with the veto and the permanent membership. And they put Article 109 exactly telling the P5, this is a temporary gift. You defeated the Nazi Germany, fine. Here is a temporary gift, a veto to enjoy for 10 years, but we are going to remove that in 1955. And everybody in the first General Assembly in 1946 was talking about elimination of the veto. Even before the Cold War, in 1946, most of the members in the first General Assembly in London were talking about elimination of the veto, and that must happen in 1955. We are 2026, and nobody talks about elimination of the veto. So it's really sad, and this is why our project opens this conversation. We want to hear from member states why 79 years ago, a lot of them in the first General Assembly were talking about elimination of the veto, and why after so many wars and genocides and armed conflict and civilian victims and children dead in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, all because of the veto, today the member states are so lazy and they don't talk about those. Thank you.
Thank you, Veselin. Very direct to the point there. I should note that we've just spent 5 sessions discussing Article 109 with Shayar Shari, based on his new book, The Future in the Past. So something we're familiar with. Winston, I see your hand up, so I will come to you first for questions. If anybody else has questions, please raise your hand digitally or physically. Winston, you will need to unmute.
Are you hearing me now?
We are, yes.
Yes. I want to really congratulate Veselin for his presentation here. Fundamentally, I agree with him. It's in the period of crisis that we can really introduce changes. Remember the effort in the League of Nations and the UN. There were periods of crises. The attempts to reshape international law came out of a series of crises, etc. And his effort on the Secretariat, I think, is very much central to any reforms that we may have. I just have one question for him, namely, whether it is not the case that we have not had strong secretaries general modeled after Dag Hammarskjöld, because the Security Council has been allowed to act without very much visibility in its action in proposing candidates, and two, because of the limitations visited on the General Assembly, namely that it must generally accept the recommendations of the Council. Not that that is constitutionally required, but what we have had in practice.
Yes, Winston, you're absolutely right. The Security Council prefer very shy, obedient Secretary General. And not only, Dag Hammarskjöld, as you mentioned, was an exception. I will add to that Kofi Annan as another exception. But the rest of the Secretary General were very obedient. They will listen to P5, including the current one. I wonder why there is no United Nations proposal for peace building in Gaza. Why Donald Trump should make a board of peace and not the United Nations? Again, it started with the United Nations resolution, but that everything was out of hands anymore. And ideally, it will be United Nations, like they did many times in Cambodia, in Timor-Leste, in Sierra Leone, in Haiti. Where is United Nations in Gaza is my question, and why Antonio Guterres doesn't talk about this. So exactly as you said, because the Security Council prefers somebody very silent and obedient, and they propose such person, Ban Ki-moon, perfect example. There was Shashi Tharoor from India as a candidate, but obviously he faced the rejection of one of the permanent members. So yes, that's why if the General Assembly selects the Secretary General, the General Assembly should have that final voice out of 2 or 3 candidates proposed to it. Security Council still can vet. They still can remove someone. Yes. But at the end of the day, the ultimate choice should go to the General Assembly. And you know, when I talk about this, people say, but that's not really a good point. I remember the British Prime Minister, permanent representative saying, because how we will end up with Secretary General supported by 55% instead of 100. And my counter argument was, now it is 5%, not even 55. Yes. It's never been 100. General Assembly never did anything about that. It's always rubber stamping. You select with 5%. I suggest 55% against 45%. And by the way, the next candidate could be the next Deputy Secretary General. Somehow to unify the world, I guess the elected Secretary General can appoint the contender, the second one, with 45% as a deputy. Absolutely perfect situation. But yes, you're absolutely right, Winston. You pointed why Security Council prefers such candidate, and that's why we all suffer, obviously.
Thank you, Winston. Thank you, Veselin. So I am looking for any further questions, and I don't see. In that case, I would ask maybe Augusto, if you'd like to say a word or two to close us, and then I will bring us to time.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for organizing this very interesting conversation. I think that the speakers have highlighted, some of the complexities that we have had to confront in in the process of coming up with a version of what a new UN Charter could look like. Let me just tell you very briefly what the next stage of this project is going to be. The second charter makes reference to some protocols that have to be developed to operationalize some of the ideas, for instance, on the collective security side, on the disarmament side. And, these are unfulfilled promises of the 1945 Charter. And so in 2026, we are going to be working with a group of experts, specialists, for instance, in the area of disarmament, to try to operationalize some of the principles embedded in the second charter. Furthermore, last November, we released a number of protocols already in fairly finished form, of which I would like to highlight some very, very interesting ideas on new ways to finance the UN system. And in the preparation of that document in particular, I would like to express my gratitude to John Blasto, who made some very important contributions to the formulation of the ideas embedded in that document. So this project is not over. It will continue to deliver a conceptual framework. And the idea is that, who knows, within a year or two, we're going to have not just a second charter, but a body of other legal instruments, protocols, and materials that will take the second charter where the original 1945 chapter never went, which is in the operationalization of some of these ideas. We're way past our bedtime, so thank you so much for hosting this event, and I look forward to our next event in March.
Indeed, we are. So, to that note, we will meet next on March 14th for our next session. I would like to thank those of us who are still here. So, Augusto Lopez Claras, Veselin Popovsky, Guy Sinclair, and I don't see, I think everybody else is dropped.
Andrew Strauss.
Andrew, where are you? In front of me. I apologize. Andrew, thank you all. It has been a really edifying experience.